Numerous movies have been made about the Vikings, and thousands of books have been written, but wrapped in a romantic halo even now, at the time of their existence, the Vikings adhered to largely incomprehensible, if not eerie traditions, from the perspective of modern men. You're watching Flip Side of History, and today we will tell you about Vikings and their traditions as well as rituals. Let's start with morals and lifestyle. Despite the constant raids, the Vikings, during their free time, were engaged in farming, hunting, and fishing. At the same time, compared to many other peoples of that time, the Vikings had extraordinary traditions and customs. For example, any dealings were done simply by using the word, and that was enough. Nowadays it's hard to imagine such a thing. Breaking a word or an oath, like lying, was punishable by death on a par with such crimes as murder and theft. Condemned oath-breakers and liars were drowned in the river. According to Viking beliefs, even in the afterlife, such people were believed to be in eternal torment, drowning day after day in the waters of the underground river of Scandinavian hell. The Vikings considered it indecent to discuss the misfortunes of a kindred. If he himself asked for help, it was given, otherwise it was not. Vikings never argued with angry people, and generally angry people were considered unworthy of a Viking. Moreover, a stranger could never be mocked, for mockery, the Scandinavians believed, was sooner or later followed by a troll who would tear out the mocker's tongue. The Vikings were also very touchy about their fallen on the battlefield, practically never leaving them behind. The most interesting thing is that the only honorable death was death in battle. In this case, the fallen warriors were picked up by the Valkyries, who took the heroes to the realm of Odin. The souls of those who died at home or of old age were sent to another place, the realm of the goddess Hel, which was considered unworthy of a man. It was especially unworthy, by the way, to die of old age, since in such a case a foe had every right to mock the deceased, who had taken an unmasculine death. That is why, anticipating death, the elderly Vikings asked their relatives to perform a ritual murder. Procopius of Caesarea, for instance, wrote of this. They were not supposed to prolong the life of the old or sick, but whenever any of them was struck down by illness or old age, he was bound to ask his relatives to remove him from the living, as soon as possible. Then his relatives, having stacked a large and high pile of firewood and placed this man on the very top of it, would send someone to him, but not a relative armed with a knife. The murderer of this person is not supposed to be related to him in any way. When the murderer of their kinsman returns to them, they immediately set fire to the whole heap of wood, beginning at the bottom. When the fire is extinguished, they collect the bones and immediately bury them in the ground. The Vikings had a special attitude toward revenge. First of all, it was believed that a real warrior would not immediately take revenge for a killed relative or said brother. The longer the wait, the better the revenge would be calculated. And when the offender died, the Viking was sure to leave his weapon in his body. This was considered both a calling card of the avenger and a sign that the grievance was washed away in blood. A frequent custom of blood vengeance was to burn the enemy in his own home. No women, children, or old people were to be in the room, for killing the weak and infirm was considered unworthy of a true warrior. But often it did not come to the very fact of killing. Since every person in the harsh conditions of Scandinavia counted, the offender could go to the mountains with his father and eldest son for 40 days by the decision of the council. The property was considered a reserve that could go back to the relatives of the murdered or the offended person. After 40 days after the return, the family of the deceased was offered a bride price, vir, and only if the relatives refused to accept it, the offender was in mortal danger. The practice of carrying out children was an incredible one. A newborn baby was placed on the ground in the house, and no one had the right to touch him until the father decided whether to keep the baby or not. Decisions were also influenced by dreams and predictions of local sorcerers or wise men. If the child confessed, the father took him in his arms and poured water over him. This was called giving a name. The fact that the Vikings were fearless in battle is well known. Before going into battle, they would chew on the edge of their shields on purpose to unleash their fury. But there was another kind of warrior, the so-called berserker. Sorcerers gave them a special brew of mushrooms before the fight, so berserks felt neither pain nor fatigue, and in battle were especially fierce, knowing neither pity nor mercy. The funeral ceremony of the Vikings also surprises modern men. Death was considered a transition to Odin's castle, so the relatives looked happy and fulfilled. All the property of the deceased was divided into 3 parts. One was given to the family, the second went to the funeral feast, and the third went to the proper vestments. As a rule, a dog and a horse were buried together with a warrior, and also a slave or a concubine who expressed a wish to go with her master. Before her death, the slave went to the homes of the deceased relatives, engaging in physical pleasures with them. But the thing is that in doing so, the relatives asked her to convey that they made love to her solely out of love for the deceased person. Sometimes the wife was ready to leave with her husband. In this case, of course, there was no lovemaking with the relatives. The most unconventional tradition was an assembly once every 9 years. At that time, representatives of all the tribes gathered on the land of the most important leader, chief. 9 males from each kind of animal were sacrificed, as well as 9 of the most worthy warriors. And to become a sacrifice at such a feast was considered the highest honor for a Viking. When the men were killed, their blood was sprinkled on all those present, and the bodies of the sacrificed were hanged by the ribs in the sacred grove. Male and female slaves. The purpose of any invasion was to improve one's livelihood. The fate of captured men and women could be very different. Many were captured for the sole purpose of receiving a ransom, and if no ransom was expected, the slaves remained at home. Men did the hardest work, with the exception of artisans who had a special status. Male slaves had the right to marry only with the master's permission, and the marriage was essentially not considered a family. Women and girls also helped Viking wives at home, just as they had no rights, and some went with the Vikings on campaigns to meet the sexual needs that arose. But there were also occasions when women slaves were given rather high status in the Viking family. Curiously, the Vikings themselves could also become slaves. For example, those who could not pay off a debt. If he could not work off the debt, he could be repurchased by his relatives after proving that their own property was used for the repurchase. If the slave's property was used as a ransom, the transaction was considered invalid, and all the property passed to the master. The children of slaves were also considered slaves from the moment they were born. Moreover, the master was responsible for the actions of slaves. For example, if a slave killed someone, it was the master who dealt with his relatives. No one really cared what he did to the slave afterwards. It is worth noting that the Vikings considered the death by a slave a terrible disgrace, which could be the cause of blood revenge from the relatives to the master of the slave. But if we set aside such collisions, in fact, the Vikings also tried to protect slaves, because luck could not smile on every campaign. The Bloody Eagle. This is one of the most terrifying Viking customs that has been recognized by modern scholars as being real. Although many historians call it a sacrifice, it is actually more likely an execution. The condemned man was laid on his stomach. His back was cut open by breaking his ribs, which were then pulled out. It was as if wings were sticking out, which is why this execution got its name. Thank you for watching our video. Subscribe to Flip Side of History for more videos from us, and also leave a like.